As we all know, Desmond Greaves was the driving force behind the Connolly Association. What was he like as a political strategist?
Well, Desmond Greaves was, of course, the most prominent and best known activist of the association. Later became very well known as a Labour historian, and he edited the monthly paper and had edited it from 1951 until his death 30 years later in 1988. And he was a remarkable person with a very strong personality, very learned, very witty, a vast range of knowledge about a whole lot of subjects, and very much committed to this strategy of trying to make the Irish question a big issue in British Labour politics. He had been he was in the Communist Party, he had joined it in the 1930s. And, but of course the Connolly Association as such was a separate organisation, and Greaves was very important in keeping the distinction between the CP on the one hand and the Connolly Association on the other. Most members of the Connolly Association would have been either the Labour Party or no party at all. But Greaves in the 1950s came to the view that the key issue in Ireland was the question of national democracy, national independence, the need for national unity. The main obstacle in the way of that, and the main obstacle in the path of reuniting Ireland was, of course, Ulster Unionism. And Ulster Unionism could be destabilised by raising the issue of the discrimination in the north of Ireland, and later raising the question of the lack of equality between nationalists and Unionists in the north. And that essentially was the civil rights approach. I think it's fair to regard Greaves as the inventor, if that's the word, of the idea of a civil rights movement, the concept of a civil rights movement as a way of destabilising unionism, breaking its standing in the eyes of British public opinion and Labour public opinion, and finding a peaceful way through eventually towards some kind of united Ireland. And his work in Britain, which the Connolly Association embodied, was devoted to that end.
And when you returned to Ireland, did you find that there were many changes?
Well, I came back to Ireland in 1961, where I got a job in Trinity College Dublin as a lecturer in social policy, having built on my degree in economics and the work I did in London University, which I attended for a period while in London. And I didn't rejoin any political party, didn't rejoin the Labour Party, for example, and I remained aloof from party politics ever since. But I got quite active in pressure group politics. I've spent my adult life really since coming back to Ireland in pressure group politics, Wolfe Tone Society in the 1960s and so on. And of course this was a much more progressive decade, the 1960s, than the previous 1950s. The 50s had been a period of heavy net immigration. 1960s, of course, you had the growth rate of the economy more than doubled on what it previously had been. There was a growth in employment, a growth in the labour force, and accompanying side by side with this economic improvement, you had quite marked political changes. The Labour Party, which had been in coalition with Fine Gael twice in the 1950s, stayed aloof from coalition and stayed independent, and grew markedly during the 1960s from the time in 1961 when there was one Labour TD in Dublin to 1969 when there were 8 or 9, and when its vote was greater than Fine Gael in that 1969 election. At the same time, of course, you had the change in the Catholic Church, where you had the Vatican Council, more liberal period developing in the Church. You had the advent of television. The Republican movement had, of course, packed in the border campaign in early '62. That came to an end, and the futility of military activity on the border was widely accepted by Republicans, and there was a new searching for a new role by Republicans, and one reflection of that was, of course, the setting up of the commemorating Wolfe Tone in 1963 in a series of public lectures which some key Republicans had organised. This was the bicentenary of Tone's birth, 200 years afterwards in 1963. And following that, you got the Wolfe Tone Society, and I joined it about a year after it was founded and became active in that. And the Wolfe Tone Society and similar activity during the 60s encouraged the politicization of the Republican movement. So you had Labour going left, the Republican movement becoming political, rising living standards generally, and a whole series of important commemorations during that decade. The Wolfe Tone bicentenary in '63, the 1966 50th anniversary of the Rising, 1968 100th anniversary of James Connolly's birth, which drew a lot of attention to Connolly and his legacy. In time encouraging, of course, the development of the civil rights movement in the North at the end of the decade, 68-9, and all of that during that period I was involved in much of that activity.
You joined the Wolfe Tone Society. What were its key aims and who were the key people involved in it?
Well, the Wolfe Tone Society was what you might call a kind of green think tank, where a number of like-minded people, mostly independent nationalist Republicans or left-wingers of one kind or another, interacted and sought to take initiatives which would have some advanced progressive causes more widely in the general public. There were three branches basically. The most important one was Dublin, which was probably the most active, but then also Belfast, where Jack Bennett and Fred Heatley were involved. In Dublin you had myself, Roy Johnson, Micheál Lynchig, Cathal MacLiam, Inchi McEowen. We used to meet in the house of the architect Inchi McEowen, who wrote the book Survivors, on which many people will know of. And a number of others. They were mostly, as I said, independent Republicans or nationalists or left-wing people. And it sponsored a whole lot of things, or sought to encourage a whole lot of progressive developments, saving the West in the sense of supporting Father McDiar's cooperative activity, preserving the Tailors' Hall was one of the initiatives we took a part in. Seeking to encourage the civil rights type activity in the North, and that was particularly a function, of course, of the Belfast branch, but the Dublin group supported it. And then towards the end of the decade, of course, or the middle of the decade, you'd be critical of the move towards the common market, which was embodied in the Anglo-Irish Free Trade Agreement in 1965-6. And so the anti-common market campaign, which took off in the early 70s, was really kind of, initially at least, an offshoot of the Wolfe Tone Society.
Can you comment on the politicisation of the Republican movement and your involvement in that?
Well, in the 1960s, the Republican movement was trying to make itself relevant again after the collapse of the border campaign. And the only way it could become relevant, of course, was to take up political issues, which generally would have pointed towards it, a movement towards the left. Issues like housing, opposition to a sudden rush towards free trade, opposition to surrender of sovereignty in the common market, which the Irish state had applied to join in 1961, though it didn't actually join until a decade later. So the Republicans were becoming political, and the Wolfe Tone Society was one element in that story, I think, because it encouraged the Republican movement to individual Republicans like Carl Goulding and Thomas McGilla and so on, to take an interest in the civil rights movement and civil rights issues in the North. And they may well have taken interest in that anyway, but it was just there was a fair amount of interaction, personal interaction between individuals in the Wolfe Tone Society and well-known Republicans, and later on in opposition to the common market membership. So these were themes of the 1960s, and of course during the 1960s, as I said earlier on, you had the bicentenary of Tone, you had the 1966 Rising commemoration, you had the 68 centenary of Connolly's birth, and a lot of interest in James Connolly, and so there's quite a lot of political activity which the Republicans were taking part. But of course the Labour Party was also moving to the left at that time, and was growing in strength. And of course this, to some extent, was a kind of challenge to the Republican movement and Sinn Féin at the time, to see what would they not get involved in political activity as well. And the late Seamus Costello, of course, was very anxious to abandon the abstentionist policy, which had been traditionally Republican policy. But the Wolfe Tone Society was a group of individuals, and you know, its activity shouldn't, and influence shouldn't perhaps be exaggerated, but it was one element in the general politicization, or encouraging the politicization of the Republicans, and trying to encourage involvement by Labour and left-wing people in civil rights activity in the north and in championing the national question generally.
What about the political campaigns you were involved in, particularly the campaign against the Common Market, or the EEC as it was called in those days?